I wanted to talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing in Scotland. We've been working with the Scottish Government now for about 3 years, I suppose, looking at different ways of engaging the public in decision making. Most recently, we've been working with them on participatory budgeting, which is a really big piece of work for the Scottish Government. I don't know if, I'm sure you've all been reading the SNP's manifesto for the Scottish elections, but if for some reason it slipped through the inbox, then the commitment they made was for a 1% of local government budgets to be allocated through participatory budgeting by the end of this Parliament, by about 2019-2020. Now that's a very large amount of money. In a place like Glasgow, it could be over £1 million. And so to create the structures for that kind of participatory budgeting to be open, to be transparent, to be trusted, to be the sort of thing that you could put public money through, is an undertaking on the scale of the work in Paris, on a scale of some of the projects that you've just been hearing about. So our work with them has been to do small pieces of work, to test those participatory budgeting methods, and particularly digital ones, to understand how we can create the infrastructure on which much larger pieces of crowdsourcing and much larger pieces of democracy can rely. We've been lucky in that we've worked with 5 technology providers, all of whom have offered their solutions to councils across Scotland, and with whom we've built a really productive relationship. I know a couple of them are in the room, and I'm not just saying it because they are. The work that we've been doing has been focused on looking at what support and skills government needs to understand the input that it's getting and to work with digital tools, but also trying to understand what citizens need. And one of the things that I'd reflect on from what we just heard from Angeline is that there is a big difference between the way in which people express their needs and desires and the way in which policymakers hear them. People tend to speak in human. They speak about personal experiences. They speak about, well, you know, I want it to be like this, I want it to be like that. Policymakers speak in institution. They speak about which policy it is, whose policy it is, who's responsible for it. And there's a lot of potential for dissatisfaction, there's a lot of potential for problems in those two languages. Because if we aren't able to translate people's human experiences into a set of policy prescriptions or a set of ideas that can be fed into a decision-making system, then both sides are going to end up frustrated. And I've seen it myself. I used to be a civil servant before I set up Democratic Society 10 years ago. And the work that I did then was very policy heavy. I worked in the Treasury, so we were doing all sorts of stuff around finance, all sorts of stuff around business regulation, and we consulted a lot. I did loads of consultations, and every single time people didn't send things back in the format that we wanted them to, because we were asking them policy-related questions. And except for the lobbyists and the people who are paid to understand how policy processes work, you know, members of the public, charities, small organisations just sent back what they thought. And we didn't really have a method for translating what they thought about a huge range of issues into a single policy prescription. And I think that goes double when it comes to the EU. Because if you imagine one of those 5 areas that you just saw on the screen, they will be areas that have a fundamental impact right down to ground level. You know, every local authority in Europe, all thousands of them, will be affected by work on employment and social rights. You know, every single member state's government will have its say. And then it's at the European level as well. So I think the loving criticism or disagreement I would have from the approach that says, well, we have to have an EU-level crowdsourcing pilot, is that you can't just have an EU-level anything, because there is no just EU level for the way in which people actually experience policy in their real lives. There is only the local, the national, and the things that start from citizens. So for me, I would start with a citizen focus, and I would start with a policy focus. And the policy, sure, is an EU-level policy, but you have to link it into the networks that are working with it in local areas and in national areas too. Because there isn't an EU-level network that reaches to every neighbourhood and every community. But there are networks in this town that know the networks that do. And I think if we can work through those sorts of structures, you can build something that looks much more repeatable, that looks much more useful, both to policymakers and to citizens, and can try and work with people in the experiences that they have. So I just want to bring one more lesson back in from the work we've been doing in Scotland. We've also done a report with the Government Digital Service on digital consultation. And the most significant part about it was that everyone felt frustrated with the system as it is. Everyone felt that we had to get beyond just asking questions and expecting answers. So for me, crowdsourcing is an important part of where the EU needs to develop its work. But it also has to invest in other sorts of areas. It has to think about mini-publics, discussion forums, citizens' juries, all of the sorts of techniques that are out there and really widely used all across the member states to try and bring different sorts of voices in. I think there is a real risk that we create an environment that privileges people like us, people who like sitting in rooms and talking about policy, rather than people like my mum, who doesn't like listening to me talk about policy when I go home and would much rather talk about what's been going on at the local church or in the village fair. And I think that those sorts of differences of view are really important to bring in, and we can't do it unless we have a real understanding of the richness of the experience of people out there. And to some extent, that's why we have to rely on politicians, because for all, politicians are a pretty despised breed in Britain and elsewhere. In practice, they are the ones who are out there on the doorstep talking to real people every single day. And so if we can work with them to construct the ways in which we can reach people, and if we can work with the networks that are out there, then I think we can build a foundation for crowdsourcing and for all sorts of other democratic engagement that will be able to stand the tests that the current wave of populism and the current crises and the multiple crises in the EU are throwing at it. Thanks very much.